Okay, on this brilliant note, let's start this session. And I think, yeah, for me, it's a great or extreme pleasure and honor actually to introduce our two exceptional speakers for this afternoon. Two exceptional artists, theorists, and cultural critiques. In Kara Lynch's words, it would be two mentors, at least to me. So please let us give a warm welcome to John Afrofuturism and Tate. And I will introduce them briefly, not as much as they would deserve to, but I want to give them more space to talk about their work. And I came across John's work through his films that he produced as part of the Black Audio Film Collective that he co-founded in the 80s. And here I'm talking about films like Hensworth's song, Riot, and 7 songs for Malcolm X, but also The Last Angel of History that will be featured tonight at the exhibition opening of Afrofuturism 2, together with Kara Lynch's work, who I will introduce later. John is also the director of the film production company Smoking Dogs Films, and I really like this title, of course. And we will be able to see his latest film, My News, is just after this session that he will introduce and then take his questions afterwards. He's also busy with his producers, Lina Gopal and David Roth, to finalize a film for the Liverpool Biennale on Stuart Hall. It's not a film, it's a video installation. Yeah? Okay. So if you're free in September, go to Liverpool. Greg Tate is currently a visiting professor on the history of Afrofuturism and Black science fiction at Brown University. Another title that is amazing, I think. Greg is a writer and cultural critique. His books include Flyboy and the Buttermilk, Midnight Lightning, Jimi Hendrix and the Black Experience, and Everything But the Burden, what white people are taking from black culture. Greg is also a musician and part of the Burnt Sugar Ensemble, and luckily he agreed to play some of this music, but also Afrofuturistic sounds tonight at the after party of the exhibition opening. So both Greg and John have been crucial inspirations and contributors to the discourse and aesthetics of Afrofuturism, the concept and movement that will be central stage of this afternoon, but also evening. The idea of this panel came to me at the last year's festival when we heard a presentation on African diasporic literature in which sci-fi text was analyzed the same way as an autobiographical fiction or novel. And I was thinking, or I was wondering what happens if we were to take Black sci-fi narrative also as a genre more seriously. What if we think more seriously about the possibilities, but also the potentiality of technology and science as a way to turn to the past, to history, to fragments and crossroads in order to radically reconfigure the future? By keeping in mind, and I think that's very important, as Samuel Delaney argued in The Last Angel of History, that sci-fi literature does not try to predict the future, but rather offers a significant distortion of the present. So this panel provides an introduction to this whole afternoon of Afrofuturism and time and space traveling, and I would invite you to fasten your seatbelt and enjoy. And Greg will start with his presentation, and then John will continue.
Okay. Ooh. Loud and popping. My talk is called Hopscotch, a few hundred notes towards the most apocalyptic manifesto of Afrocentric futurism ever. Does anybody know what hopscotch is? Yeah, street games, right? Yeah, so it's a random series of numbers that are put down on a grid. Throw something on it, the person has to hop on one leg to that number. But it's also the name of one of my favorite novels of all time. I say it's in my top 5. It's by the Argentinian Julio Cortázar. And in the novel, he sequenced all the numbered chapters out of order. So you can read it in that arbitrary sequence, or you can actually, if you want to take the time, you can read it in sequence. So I use that to actually structure the format of my reading, my talk, because I had too many thoughts, but I didn't want to lose all of them by trying to read it in sequence. So I've held myself to a tight 30-minute time frame. So you give Yeah, that's right. Put me on the clock. Yes. Okay. 4. All conversation and manner of concoctions about Black futurism inevitably refer us back to the futures imagined long before now. The field and phenomenon we call Black futurism is as much about historicizing the future as it is about God-like hammering of new Jerusalems into being. 1. So one question that's been on my mind a lot recently is why Afrofuturism, why now, and why so much curiosity about the subject in Germany of all places. Because every time I've ever been invited to speak in Germany, it has always been to speak on this topic. And after the 3rd time, you find yourself asking, why are nominally progressive German intellectuals so curious about what Black Americans think about the future? Now, I have several thoughts on this, but I'll share those a bit later. 4. I feel the need to acknowledge myself as someone with a long history in this emerging field of Black futurism. As a Black American male of a certain age and background, I was generationally predisposed to be a Black futurist from practical birth. The Russians sent their Sputnik rocket up 10 days before I was born in 1957 and initiated the race for space between America and the Soviets. The first reading I did as a child was science fiction. The first movies I loved were horror and sci-fi. And like almost nearly every Black American male I know born post-World War II, I was a voracious reader of Marvel comics and the troubled visionary creations of Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Steve Ditko. Fantastic Four, X-Men, Spider-Man, the Hulk, Doctor Strange, the Black Panther. Marvel's Black Panther, in fact, presciently appeared in the comics several months before Huey Newton and Bobby Seale launched their famed party for self-defense in Oakland in 1976. Simultaneous with those readings in America's most spectacularly graphic literature of the fantastic, Black Americans were out in the nation's streets rioting, rebelling, and rhetorically advocating the creation of a radically and racially transformed America. Martin Luther King envisioned a future America where the relentless power of protesting organized love would legalize economic and social justice for its people. Malcolm X described an American nightmare whose resolution would come by either the ballot or the bullet, or the briefcase or the shotgun, to use Brother Omar Little's later opposition. What made the science fiction of Marvel Comics more resonant with my generation of young Black men was that all its superheroes were troubled, tormented creatures full of rage and anxiety about the state of the world, their own human frailties, and the power they've been given to combat evil and embrace chaos. For the Black futurists who came of age in the 60s and 70s, the vision was always more apocalyptic than utopic, and because of what was going on in our popular culture, which at the time included our radical popular culture, like the Panthers and the Black Arts Movement, as well as Parliament Funkadelic, the future seemed like a utopic and dystopic Afrocentric alternative universe where post-civil rights Black America was already living and thriving, at least on Soul Train, in the concert room, and on the dance floor. While the post-King riot corridors many of us lived in was beset by spirit-strangling poverty, ecological ruin, and walking dead dope fiends. 39. Black futurism implies a dissatisfaction with the Black American status quo that must be mediated by aggressive magic and science, that are in turn supported by George Clinton's market-savvy colloquialism, rhythm, and business. A necessary footnote here would be Black futurist and free jazz avatar Cecil Taylor's response to the question, what would white people never understand about Black culture? The magic of rhythm was Taylor's typically mysterious reply. 10. So this emergent field that we call Black futurism must be considered a set of narrative operations that unfolds in 4 or 5 dimensions simultaneously. There are the many documented artifacts and avatars of Black futurism we know from music, film, and literature, the canon, as it were. There's also a need to recognize Black futurist claims on a historical timeline, from the carbon-dated birth of proto-human life and society in South Africa's Kalahari Desert 1 million years ago, during the tool-making, kinship-forming, fire-creating time of so-called Java man. This Black futurism recognizes the origins of human language, consciousness, art, music, and spirituality among our oldest chromosome-dated chromosome marked human ancestors. The Khoisan people of Kalahari, whose elegant and stylish cave paintings depict dreamtime encounters with elongated transhuman hybrids. This black futurism notes the appearances of what has been described as a natural nuclear reactor in Gabon over 2 million years ago, and also notes that James Brown's favorite place to visit in Africa in the 70s was Gabon. Coincidence or natural attraction, synchronicity or elective affinity. The history of black futurism is not shy about reclaiming the pyramids, but also the Great Wall in Zimbabwe and the Nile Valley cultures that produced the Kushite Empire, the Nubian kingdoms, and Pharaonic Egypt. Nor can it avoid, as a source of cosmology, all that we know of voodoo from Benin to Homian culture and Yoruba cultures in West Africa, or the astronomically correct references found in the divination and belief systems of Mali's Dogon. There is a supposition that Benjamin Banneker, one of America's first great polymaths, mathematicians, clockmaker, astronomer, and architect, was the progeny of a Dogon-born father and an Irish mother, and this is also not lost on black futurism. Nor is the centrality of Benin to Homian Vodun to the strategic successes of the first successful revolution led by blacks in Western history on the island of Haiti, San Domingo. This black futurism notes that the sheer appearance of David A. Walker's appeal, a Jeremiah of retributional violence, encouraging blacks to strike and kill slave owners, was powerful enough to demand banning by slave owners in states where most black folk were illiterate. However, given the appearance of the antebellum scene of Moses Dixon and the Black Masonic secret society known as the Knights of Liberty that he presided over, and which is said to have freed 70,000 slaves and organized 50,000 free black men to march into Atlanta to crush the citadel of slavery by force, the banning of Walker's appeal was both logical and ineffective. Of course, Nat Turner needed neither Masonic freemen nor Walker's fiery diction to compel his flock to take up arms against the plantation owners and their wives and children. Black futurism finds its first real-life military superhero or superheroine, however, in the person of a woman known as Black Moses, Harriet Tubman, who will personally rescue over 1,000 black Americans from chattel slavery and lead them to the promised land. Tubman will, during the Civil War, also lead the famous attack on the Combahee River plantation in South Carolina that will liberate 700 of her people by leading a Union army into battle that she helped arm with swamp reconnaissance, counterintelligence, swords, guns, sea mines, bombs, bullets, and ship sinkings in a scene spectacularly worthy of any James Bond climax. Before she leaves this mortal plane, however, she offers us these wise, cautionary lines about the colonized black imagination. Quote, "I have freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if they'd only known they were slaves." Every great dream begins with a dreamer, declared Tubman in the 1890s. Always remember you have within you the strength, the patience, and the passion to reach for the stars to change the world. 57. The song lyric that best describes the Black Futurist program from a critical and a performative vantage viewpoint is George Clinton's line, "We have come to reclaim the pyramids, partying on the mothership." What Clinton locates for us in one scrappy verse is that Black Futurism is just another name for African epistemology. And like Emma Goldman, if we can't dance, we don't want to be part of your revolution. The greatest dancing rebel in American history, James Brown, was the alchemist who transformed funk from an adjective to an action word and a state of being, a transcendent body in motion. But Clinton was the one who harnessed that force and converted it into a post-Black Power movement. Here's our chance to dance our way out of our constriction, Clinton will say in another song. While in another he states that with the rhythm it takes to dance through what we have to live through, you can dance underwater and not get wet. In the wake of American housing's post-prime lending apocalypse, we cite the phenomenon of underwater mortgages, contracts between home consumers and banks that force the consumer to cover the loan shark bank's loss on a loan for worthless property. Statistics show that Black and Hispanic homeowners are the disproportionate victims of these loan extortion policies, and thus more viciously subject to mass foreclosure and home ownership exit. Any Black Futurist project that did not ask how their dancing underwater while not getting wet would be pointless and politically speaking too precious for words. 19. All Black futurism conjures thoughts of a blacker and brighter African-centric past and a bleaker and more anxious and fractured African present. For this Black futurism we speak of as a cultural matrix that thrives on opposites and oppositions, nonlinearity, conflict, and asymmetrical warfare, alien contact, and alien distances as well. It shimmers on shifting quicksand, always in pursuit of higher ground. It aspires to higher frequencies, rumbles in the lower depths. It revels in the severe creative benefits of Black existential trauma and strains at the limits of Black transcendence and liminality and triumphalism. The defining trope of Black American literature is invisibility. Not just the invisibility produced by the white social gaze during and after slavery, but as well the invisibility and the voids and the silences and the desires and the apprehensions produced by gazing too deeply within the Black American psyche, the Black American self, for too long. It is for this reason that our literary tradition has always been prophetic and phantasmagorical and surrealist more than social realist and very future-oriented. It also helps explicate why the Black American canon of literature reads like a litany of ghost stories about various manner of fantastically radicalized ephemera. The Confessions of Nat Turner is told to Thomas Gray, The Mystery, The North Star, The Autobiography of a Slave, The Bondswoman's Narrative, Blake, or The Huts of America, We Wear the Mask, Sports of the Gods, The Souls of Black Folk, Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, The Conjure Man Dies, Their Eyes Were Watching God, Mules and Men, Tell My Horse, Native Son, The Long Dream, Invisible Man, If He Hollers, Let Him Go, We'll Tell It on the Mountain, Giovanni's Room, The Fire Next Time, The System of Dante's Hell, The Dutchman, Blues People, The Autobiography of Malcolm X, Soul on Ice, Revolutionary Suicide, Blood in My Eye, Blind Man with a Pistol, Freelance Pallbearers, If They Come in the Morning, The Quality of Mercy, Black Magic Poetry, Shadow and Act, Dunford Travels Everywhere, The Catacombs, Scarecrow, Sister X and the Victims of Foul Play, Groove, Jive, and Bang Around, The Wig, The Bluest Eye, The Color Purple, for colored girls who considered suicide when the rainbow is enough, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, Daughters of the Dust, Rhinestone Sharecropping, Beloved, Corregidora, Mumbo Jumbo, I Am a Cowboy in the Boat of Rock, Axis Bold as Love, Electric Ladyland, Band of Gypsies, Last Days in Time, Rainbow Bridge, Nova, Dahlgren, It's After the End of the World, Don't You Know That Yet, Maggot Brain, The Mothership Connection, The Clones of Dr. Funkenstein, Stars in My Pocket Like Grains of Sand, All Night Visitors, Things That I Do in the Dark, Reflex and Bone Structure, Scarifications, Eye Tattoo, A Black Witch of Salem, Devil in a Blue Dress, Wild Seed, Parable of the Sour, The Healing, Negrophobia, The White Boy Shuffle, The Life and Death of Oscar Wilde, Joe Turner's Come and Gone, Who Fears Death, Through the Valley of the Nest of Spiders, The Broken Kingdoms. In these titles do not suggest the literature of an oppressed people, but the literature of a spooky, spectral, shamanistic, mythophrenic, mystical people, the literature of a hoodoo, voodoo, and what the fuck are you people? A people whose writing doesn't distinguish between excoriating the living or conjuring up the dead, or dreamy-eyed thoughts and reveries about Armageddon, the fire, next time, the literature of a race of riotous, rebellious, post-robotic aliens, Afro-Atlanteans already on Earth. Black futurism is simply put how truth crushed the earth rose to engage in intergalactic mythopoetic warfare in the 20th and 21st centuries, primarily by mutating a nation of nobodies into more than the punchline of a brilliant Burke Williams song, by using institutional invisibility and social erasure not as impediments, but as incitements to create the world and the world's history anew every goddamn day. I'll stop there.
I mean, there's no point, Greg, in trying to even replicate that. But he asked a question which I think is important. Why now? Why Afrofuturism now? And a lot of what Greg talked about seems to me to pretty much lay on the line why that may be the case now. What I want to touch on briefly is why then? Why in the early 90s a number of sci-fi obsessed, robot-leaning, loving, read too many books, young black kids, might even entertain the idea of Afrofuturism as something that might organize our lives and make sense of our existence. And I think there are a number of reasons, some of which I'll touch on, and then I think we should open it out because I'm sure you can come up with your own. Don't forget, well, let's put it this way. In 94, 95, we worked, by we I mean the Black Audio Film Collective, a group that I was part of for 17 years. Worked on a film called The Last Angel of History. You will see it later on, so there seems no point in talking about it. And one of the reasons why we made it partly had to do with the fact that we were aware we were about to die. We were about to go out. Okay? I think it was the third to last film that we did, so it's probably the film we made in our 15th year. So it was an attempt to try and summarize certain things that we'd learned. One of the things we'd learned, it seems to me, was that Afrofuturism, a term which could only have come about because of our obsessive interest in certain sonic developments, because of our obsessive interest in certain literary developments. Afrofuturism, if it meant anything at all, spoke as an anticipatory logic to some things that were just about to happen. This is 94, 95, and so let me just spell out a few of those. It seemed to us that these anticipatory logics took a number of forms, politically, let's say. It was clear that we were about to enter a moment when what might be considered the language of race was about to undergo a transformation. This is before the shift from, Afrocentrism to the post-racial, to post-black. We were just on the cusp of that. Technologically, clearly, we were in the throes of it, but it hadn't quite fully taken shape. It was clear that we were caught between two overlapping and yet distinct cultures, sonic cultures. One, the analogic, and the other, the soon-to-be digital. And the point seemed to us then was one of trying to provide an inventory of what might have been the analogic as a way of walking ourselves into the new digital world. We needed friends, we needed enemies, we needed to know who they were in order to anticipate what the digital culture about to be unleashed in its full force meant. The second sonic implication was that there had been a whole range of electroacoustic experiments across the Black Atlantic world. Lee Perry's work with Darwin, Jamaica in the 70s, Clinton's work with funk in the 70s as well, Sun Ra's largely big band inflected sonic experiments across a range of cities in America in the 50s, 60s, and the 70s, and beyond. And it seemed to us at the time that there were a number of younger musicians who were aware of certainly that triumvirate, were drawing in complicated ways from their legacies in order to reformulate a new sonic language. And so Afrofuturism was for us a way of understanding that passage. You know. The third sonic implications seem to be this, that up to that point, the full force of what young Michael Jackson had unleashed on the world hadn't quite taken shape. Right? The full reach, as Andre Herrera would call it, of Jackson's unleashing of R&B as a global phenomenon was just about to happen. This was the world just before Jay-Z and the whole thing. And that seemed to us to not just be about the migration of African-derived rhythms into the mainstream, but the reconfiguring of what constituted the relationship between black, popular, and unpopular culture. And so we were nailing our mast very clearly to the unpopular wing at that point. Politically, it seemed to us as well that however much we might try to put it off, an argument was about to be unleashed in the Black Atlantic world. Broadly put, the argument seems to me to be one encapsulated by the two books of Paul Gilroy, The Black Atlantic and Against Race. Right? And the argument was going to be, on the one hand, between the proponents of the idea that there might be something called a Black Atlantic culture, there might be something called an international vernacular of black norms, on the one hand, and people who would question both the legitimacy, viability, or even necessity for that description. In other words, there would be, to use the language of Gilroy, there would be people who saw no problem with the raciological drift in black culture, and those who found it deeply problematic. All of these seem to me to be tropes, themes, narratives that were just bubbling under the surface in 93, 94, 95. That in some ways we wanted the film to anticipate, draw out, and try and make sense of in some ways. But I think there are also other things that are worth mentioning. And Greg touched on it when he talked about Cecil Taylor's idea of the magic of rhythm. The magic of rhythm. It seemed to us that one of the things Afrocentrism as a concept allowed you to do was to track the evolution of African-derived rhythms, their permutations, their mutations, their transformations across the world. That's one of the most important things, it seems to me, why Afrofuturism seemed to us to be useful. It connected parts of the world which were investing heavily in polyrhythms, their mutations, in a way that were beginning to be seen as separate. Africa was not America, we know that. But in what ways might Africa be America? In what ways might Europe be Africa? What are the connections as well as the disconnections between parts of the world? And rhythm appeared to be one of the ways in which one can explore that secret, intangible, itinerant history of black feeling, black thought. Finally, when Thelma, those of you in the art world who know the Thelma I'm talking about.
Don't go.
Okay. Did she need to be named? Probably yes. When Thelma came up with the idea of the post-black, a number of people jumped on her and said, this is unacceptable. But I was all for it, seems to me, because it seemed, and this is one of the reasons why we also wanted to make the film. It seemed to me that the notion of a post-black held and had a certain sociological accuracy for a number of black folk on the planet. Right? It was a way of sociologically describing certain permutations and mutations inside the African diaspora. Whether those mutations and transformations could be said to be universal. In other words, whether they covered all black life was what seemed to me to be necessary to debate. But the fact that for some people, you know, being black was secondary to being a certain kind of class, that seemed to us to be something that the 90s was going to usher in, and it was going to become a major feature. You need to look at South Africa, you need to look at parts of America, United States, but I mean the Americas period, to see that in a way what she was trying to name is now in motion. It's no more just a wish, it's a sociological fact. And so one of the things one then had to do was to position what I would call the debate about Afrocentrism on the fault line between what constituted utopian and dystopian elements in black culture. It seemed to me, and it seemed to the collective, that part of the sets of transformations that hip-hop was about was very much reconfiguring, that rhetoric, the rhetoric of what constituted utopian themes and what constituted dystopian themes in black life. A number of, cultural studies people got this really way wrong in my view. Cornel West started this by talking about nihilism in a way that made nihilism in pejorative terms, like, oh yeah, black culture is all nihilistic. And people assumed that meant it was all bad. Anything nihilistic was bad. And the sense that somehow one might have a futurity which started on the basis that things really could not get any fucking worse now, seemed to me more honest rather than negative, And there was something deeply attractive, deeply compelling about some of the most oppressed figures on our planet at that point, embracing some of the most advanced technological developments at that time. Imagine that, young black kids who were taking record players, turntables, and fashioning out of the symphonies of despair and dislocation and alienation, which were obviously thematically dystopian, but were clearly also utopian at the same time, because they were anticipating things which were about to come. So to just call these things nihilist, true that may be, and offer it as something negative seems to me to be the problem. And the last century of history, and I'm interested in Afrofuturism, was precisely about trying to intervene in that debate on what constituted nihilism, what its value was in our culture, what its future is. If I stop there, that would be just fine. In terms of time, no? Okay. Well, I understand.
Then I have two questions before I open this ask, because I'm sure you all have lots of questions. Of course, I want to hear from Greg why he thinks it's interesting now in Germany. I mean, this is how you started, and you promised us to give us an answer. But to both of you, for me the question is, okay, you both named utopia, dystopia, and we had actually the discussion in the seminar Lynch joined in our seminar, and she was given the question, how do you distinguish between Afrofuturism and dystopia and utopia? Can you draw the line more clearly? And then the other question is maybe interlinked. When you think of the history of futuristic thought, in terms of Italian thought, Russian thought, but also in relation to the future industry now, it actually is quite a material impact. There's money in it, and it's also an interesting theme at the moment that comes up in Bayreuth at the university, return to the question of the future. How is then Afrofuturism positioned that? Because we also talk, as in the past, Paul Miller, aka DJ Spooky, talks about a past concept.
Around the question of why Germany and why now, and even why back in 1999 when I was invited to the Loving the Alien conference, I think some of it may go as far back in the past as the Weimar Republic, like the interest, the presentation, the curiosity about black performance, the advocacy of jazz music as the kind of background to a certain kind of social, sexual, kind of emancipatory moment in German culture. But then, if I fast forward to later, people like certainly free jazz musicians, Cecil Taylor, Sun Ra, Alfred Eiler, who were all championed here, I think, more than almost anywhere else I could think of in Europe. Milford Graves. The thing that everyone who is a devotee of those musicians knows is that they are all theorists. They are all critical thinkers. They are all people kind of engaged in investigating the semiotics and the signification of sound. The way it affects the social body, the way it affects the spiritual body, the way it affects space and time itself, its impact on politics, on the rhetoric of politics, and so forth. So in some ways, I think there's always been, as opposed to other places in Europe, which are also jazz-centric. I think of London, I think of Paris. I think in London, the interest is always trying to figure out how can we do what you do? You know, how can we recreate it technically on our own terms and sever the parts that we don't feel culturally capable of recreating. I'll put it like that. In Paris, there's just a fascination with black people being on stage. I'd say that fascination extends to Italy as well. I think Germany is the one place that's kind of been interested or attracted to this dialectic of mind and body, soul, you know, in the person of and the concept of someone like Sun Ra, to be as interested in what Sun Ra is actually saying as thought, as in what he presents with his orchestra. So I think that's one level of it. I was just in Berlin about a month ago for a conference called Apocalypse Now and Then. It was very fascinating to me that after I got the call to do that conference about 6 months ago, John called and said, "Greg, the Germans want us to come and talk about Afrofuturism." I said, "Oh, this is becoming a trend in my life. Something must be going on." But I hadn't been to Berlin since the Loving the Alien conference, and it was the first time I actually spent enough time there to get a sense of what was going on socially, why Berlin had become so attractive to a number of black artists that I knew from New York, that I knew from London. I met people I did not know before who were also from Black America. I met a young DJ who told me, he's probably in his early 30s, but he told me he had come from Brooklyn, he'd been there about 18 months. He said, "I'm probably never going back," you know. So that was interesting to me, that it was interesting to me that this group of people, who I all knew to be very politically conscious, very avant-garde in terms of their practice, had decided to come to Berlin and founded not just a place that would enable the furtherance of the art because of cheap rent and social democracy, safety nets and all those kinds of things. But they actually felt as socialized black beings in the world comfortable there, which, again, as someone who's traveled, you know, personally and with a band to many capitals of Europe, there's levels of discomfort, psychic discomfort that you feel generated by being in various European places that clearly these folks weren't feeling in Berlin. Whatever else, it's not to paint Berlin as a utopia, but it's a conversation that'll go on among black people, and particularly black people who travel. It doesn't necessarily, it's not something that we would usually talk about on the panel or publicly. You just talk about the vibe in one place as opposed to another. So I think all of those factors are kind of at play as to why here, why now. But I think as well, one of the things that came up at the panel that the Apocalypse Now and Then panel was at the end, Coach Eshin was there, and he kind of mildly chided myself and another presenter for all our popular cultural references kind of ended in the 90s. And so, of course, Kojo being Kojo, he put us up to date with several names, And so I was on a panel with another gentleman whose name I cannot remember, but he's kind of a foremost critic of American hip-hop in Germany. He had done a presentation on apocalyptic imagery in 90s hip-hop. And he said that, well, perhaps, this strain has run its course in terms of kind of there's a hip-hop reference, or metaphor. And I thought about this, and I said, well, no, I think what's happening now in the wake of global economic shockwave crisis, the kind of fracturing that it's causing inside of various Western cultures, is that for people who've been kind of predicting and almost advocating the fall of Babylon, this is kind of it's prophecy revealed. I said, because now they no longer feel as if they're the only ones on the downside, of the possibility of apocalypse that's more widely distributed, and that people who had thought themselves somewhat insulated by virtue of race, privilege, all kinds of entitlements, now are a little more anxious. Maybe as anxious as the people who are advocating apocalypse or predicting apocalypse in the 90s in hip hop. And it's very interesting because my moderator, he said, wow, it just got so dark at the end. I said, you called this conference Apocalypse Now and Then, was it only kind of light and happy when it was only black people talking about apocalypse happening, But I think that there's also, he also said something about, he was kind of admiring the fact that there was this continuum of kind of language and artifacts and expressive practices in black culture that, if you listen to me, goes all the way back 2 million years and is as current as Janelle Monáe. But, and he just talked about kind of the difficulty in talking about racial conflict, racial history in Germany, and he also referenced it in Israel relative to the Palestinians, and of course, the thing is that continuum exists, in Black American culture and other African cultures across the world, because we're kind of still at war. It's like it's kind of this expression kind of born in the trenches and the foxholes of ongoing kind of awareness of racial propaganda. But I also want to say just one more, and this it relates to what you said about Cornell and nihilism is that he, as I remember the quote, because I actually extracted it and used it in the publication, he made a contrast between the potential and possibilities of hip hop with the kind of more statistical realities that are going on among the masses of Black Americans, and it's and as you know, because you've been coming to America now for practically 30 years at least, right? That there's one America, that Black America, that exists in New York, kind of within about 12 square blocks, and then there's this other reality that exists, existed, it existed within the cities, but as those cities have become more gentrified and black populations have been dispersed, or people have like kind of left the core, the urban core of America, it's even more difficult to see. It's more invisible. Like black misery, black poverty, it's more invisible in America now than probably it ever has been for that reason. Yeah.
That I'm glad you returned to that quote, nihilism, because actually, in a way, it's a good way of answering some of your questions. I mean, you know, my problem with it's not that nihilism as a descriptive category doesn't make sense of things. It's the enforcing the pejorative implications of it that I have a problem with. Enforcing them as necessary to the descriptive category. I don't think that's necessary. I mean, you know, there's nowhere in Heidegger where nihilism exists solely and wholly as a negative term. I just don't know it. So I'm not sure where this idea that nihilism is wholly bad is coming from. But as a descriptive category, it seems to me that it offers some way of describing the shift, the utopian, dystopian shift that I'm talking about, just as sociological phenomena, you know? Like if you look at one of the categories of photographs Greg used were just folks bearing guns. Quite a lot of black folks bearing guns. But the one that had the most impact on quite a lot of us was the Fuck the Police. Now, Fuck the Police seemed to me to be an image that absolutely underscored that transition from one set to another. You know, it deployed a logic of impropriety that seemed at odds at the time, and clearly was at odds with the way in which African American masculinity had masqueraded up to that point, with the exception of a few people. There's always exceptions. Malcolm X clearly is an exception to that. But the logic of impropriety was one that, you know, the entire civil rights agenda tried to hold off at the edges. You know, must wear a suit, must only have the most pure victim to spearhead any civil rights movement, and let's not get involved in trying to call names, you know, abusing agencies of state. If you have a problem with the FBI, call Harry Belafonte, go and see Kennedy. Try and sort it out that way. Don't get involved in this squabble on the street. Well, you know, the fact was that even as those were happening, and I'm not knocking that, that's a very laudatory and worthy aim of black politics, and it was necessary that it happened then and it's happening now. But the unfortunate fact is that it doesn't completely describe every other gesture that was available, even then. You know, so whilst the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was organizing these, there were people saying, look, I am not turning the other cheek. If that motherfucker touches me, I'm going to kill him. So that was always around. And it seemed to me that what hip-hop did was to name it as a distinct, legitimate, mainstream alternative. We ain't backing away from this position. There's no Dr. King who can tell us that we should not say fuck the police. We're going to say it. You know, and that seems to me to be a real shift in the status of the black image.
Well, yeah, I guess, I mean, I just historically argue that, because I would see NWA, fuck the police, it's a flashback, it's you know, it represents a symbolic inheritance from not just the Panthers, but then the groups that came after the Panthers. Well, Robert Williams, he precedes the Panthers, but then you have the BLA, you know, who go and liberate Sada Shakur from but then, you know, from prison, but then their whole program was at one point retributive violence against police, like kind of random killing of police in New York City. So there's a way in which, in the evolution of the post-King articulation of what a black liberation movement was going to be in America, that it moved to that. And then there was, of course, the counter attack,
Yes.
COINTELPRO.
But you know, the thing with BLA and all those figures is that's what I'm saying. It's not like a distinct break. They're kind of doses. You know, BLA would still say that this project is aligned to a utopian one. We're socialists. We want to overthrow this thing for something better. You know, like this is the first time a guy said, look, we don't need to have a utopian project to say fuck you. You know what I mean? Like, we don't need to. We just say fuck you. You know what it means. I know what it means. I don't need to attach it to some.
But I mean, you know,
overarching
I think
utopian
the
project to say that.
thing that's interesting about that whole group of people, in terms of the post-King Black American struggle, is just how romantic and idealistic they all were. You know, I mean, the idea that the Black Panthers in the little house in Oakland were going to take on the U.S. government. You know, the idea that the BLA was going to take on the New York Police Department. You know, it's like the idea that Eldridge Cleaver and Huey Newton are going to, you know, create links. Well, yeah, but also create links between, like, kind of draw a certain level of support from what was going on in Algeria and Palestine and Cuba. And just, I mean, you know, all these things are, you know, they were. I remember them as a teenager being incredibly inspirational and affecting at the time. But it, you know, I mean, it took the distance of time for me to see just how wildly fantastic they were. You know, that they were. You know, if violence, the whole notion of radical violence could be considered utopic. I mean, they were living inside of that imaginary. That was their imaginary. You know, and you know, it just ran up against the sheer force of the opposition. You know, sheer numbers, sheer technological.
Way
you
to
know,
the state.
Yeah, way to the state. You know.
Can I just say one thing about the German? I mean, it seems to me that, you know, look, put it this way, I'm not sure that it's that surprising that the country that produced the Frankfurt School would take to, you know, the latest variant of modernist music. You know, I'm not sure that a culture which came into being, which found its national identity largely through philosophy and aesthetics as some of the key, you know, categories by which, you know, one understood Germanness. I'm not sure that it's surprising that it would rise to understand some of the seismic, some of the shapes on the planet. You know, you just have to look at, you know, just look at the discussion between in jazz that Ken Burns' film served up 10 years ago, whatever it was. Here you are with a 7 or 12-part series on the most innovative art form of the 20th century, jazz. And what it was reduced to by these guys was an argument that sought to sever the quote-unquote avant-gardist elements from the modernist elements. I mean, you know, why would you do that 60 years after it all? It just seems stupid. You know, and yet that's possible in the Anglo-American world. Entirely possible.
That's your curiosity?
Yeah. You know? So I'm not that surprised. I mean, some questions you need to understand, I'm not sure that's one of the ones I need to understand, is all I'm saying.
Well, I mean, something that occurred to me as well is that there's also, it's like there's several kind of semiotic, categorical specters that in Afrofuturism, I think, would kind of trigger in a contemporary German zeitgeist or subconscious even. I mean, futurism itself, I mean, it's, if you think about what futurism is in terms of modernity, it's fascistic militarism applied to the aesthetic. You know, the term gets hyphenated to blackness, and kind of that aspect of it gets neutralized to a certain extent because it's preceded by the black, but there's that kind of echo. Then there's all the echoes of ethnocentrism, of, you know, kind of racial supremacy, cultural nationalism. I mean, all these things are kind of embedded in our understanding of what black is too. So I mean, there's also just the possibility that of a certain kind of attraction to someone else having the freedom to actually play with all of those things which have to be incredibly disturbing and troubling, to a German psyche in terms of the potential kind of retrenchment of certain kind of consciousness too.
I know I'll shut up after this. I remember after the last Angel history went out on television here, a young writer from a magazine called Specs came to interview us, and I think part of the fascination of them, I can't speak for now, and I wasn't at the Love and the Alien conference. Eddie went for the collective, so I'm not sure exactly what took place there. But after that conference, it seemed to me that a whole number of people, including this guy, started to come to England to talk to us. And partly, I think that just had to do with a certain elective affinity, like the sonic affinity, the realization that some of those techno obsessions, the Basic Channel and a number of those German labels were beginning to channel had in fact antecedents somewhere else. They just seemed to. I remember when I met the Basic Channel crowd, they were saying to me, "Oh, you guys were listening to Studio One, dude." Right? We made Studio One. So there were these elective affinities between musical tastes that seemed to. That Afrofuturism seemed to out.
Well, we haven't even made the obvious Detroit-Berlin connection, which, of course, Kojo, more than anyone, I think, made evident, before Billington the Sun. That affinity has so much to do with the environment of post-industrial urban city, as well as, the sonic expression of that. And in the sense of ruin and emptiness, and a kind of a sense of what's the spiritual remains, at the same time, and then when I came to Berlin for the Love of the Alien conference, I went to a techno record store, and there was a shrine to Jeff Mills, on the wall, and people were talking about the fact that Jeff Mills was just here. Like 2 weeks ago, he was actually here. I was like, yeah, okay. I said, okay, what Kojo was telling me, it wasn't a BS, like, these guys really are gods. But it's like, these guys who are prophets without honor in Detroit, trust, are, exalted figures.
When we go to Detroit, one of the things that both confirmed and surprised me was just how many of the musicians we spoke to, Carl Crane, all of them, when you said to them, how did you get into this, they would all talk about Kraftwerk.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So here's a group of young black kids in America listening to a German, electro group and working with the implications of that. And that, I'm not sure why that surprised me so much, because when you step back from it, what that says about diasporic identity is quite profound. Most of the time when people offer you diasporic identity, so I say I'm a black British person, and people assume somehow that all the components that make up that identity are kind of quote-unquote wholly black. Well, diaspora has to mean just that. It has to mean, a community that's taking shape somewhere else, which is a product of an amalgam of different things. You know what I mean? So why would it be surprising that a group of black kids would create a black music in the diaspora, which takes bits from Germany, that when a German audience hears later on, they just hear that spectre you're talking about. They hear the ghostly echo. They think, oh yeah.
But then,
Okay, so
because Kraftwerk, that affinity for craftwork is preceded by the creation of, you know, the electric boogie, lock and pop, you know what I mean? So, but which is also symbolically interesting because it's so specifically about the identification of the android, the robot in Black American culture, not as the creation that will liberate us from labor or the monster, but as the slave, you know, who within that kind of self-imposed rigidity of the movement is also seeking liberation and autonomy in it, you know.
I don't know if you want to interrupt because that's what I wanted, the dialogue, but I think we are running out of time. And I have one question that I really want to ask, and I think it's, we need an answer for that, is Afrofuturism as a concept, a masculinist concept, because you talk about superheroines, for example, and their images, but at the same time also the last angel of history refers mainly to male individuals and their music or their literature, their artwork, etc. So how can we think of it outside the male, maybe even queer, or, you know, like, is there a possibility, or... Yeah, no, but that's not an... Yeah, okay.
No, I mean,
So
I think the thing, you know, I mean...
That's short, and then we
Yeah. Well, I mean, two things. I mean, Senator Delaney, in terms of Black queer exposition of Africa, he takes up a lot of space in the universe. I mean, and, you know, because you're talking about 40 or something books, you're talking about a life and a career that's well documented, well expressed. And it's the thing, see, this is the thing. I've lived long enough to see the things that made me a very kind of esoteric, suspect, marginal kind of Black person become the dominant face of American popular culture in terms of comic books, in terms of science fiction. These were things that in the 60s and 70s, if you were Black into these things, you maybe knew one or two other people. Like, I mean, before the mid-90s, I'd only met, in my circle of friends, 2 Black people who'd ever read Samuel Delaney's books. You know, but subsequently, of course, there's the emergence of Octavia Butler, to be considered, who also takes up an incredible amount of space. You know, one of the things that came up when I was teaching class in Brown, you know, because the question came up again about queerness, Black sci-fi. I said, well, the thing that's interesting, Delaney, of course, is as out as you could be in so many ways. Sun Ra and Octavia Butler are almost gender ambiguous. Like, no one even, people who know them don't really know how to talk about them in terms of sexuality. It's, you know, but one of the things that's occurred certainly in the last 10 years, I think, because of the precedent of Butler, is like now we have this, what I call like, maybe not a boom, but certainly a burst of Black women writing science fiction novels. You know, so there's Nadal Hopkinson and N.K. Jemisin and Nene Okafor, and in London writing more on the fantasies, Helen O'Hewing. You know, so I mean, you know, it's just been interesting, and those numbers actually, I mean, those numbers actually exceed the number of Black men who are writing science fiction. Now, when John screened Last Angel at NYU last year, we were all, you know, I mean, we were all kind of chagrined and embarrassed and kind of taken aback by how masculine that vision of what Black futurism was. But, you know, it was just so specific to the geekiness of that whole idea at that particular moment in time. Like, the concentration of people who were interested in it was so many. You know, it was such a minor voice in terms of what people thought of in terms of a Black identity at that time. Yeah.
But people also just don't. I mean, we don't have a language for exploring the homoerotic in Black culture. You know, and yes, there are masculinist and there were masculinist strains in the last stage of history, but what one is also trying to describe, and I don't think we have the necessary language or the insights to put it across. Here's the thing. There's this guy called Sun Ra, who wore what looked like a dress to me most of the time. Okay? Lived in his commune with men, almost holy men. They practiced every day, and then they went on stage and played for a number of hours in what seemed to me, looking back now,
sometimes find and expel musicians for dating,
yes.
and certainly for trying to bring them into the house.
Okay, so these are not just sonic experiments, these are also certain kinds of erotic experiments about how men conjugate, how they perform together, and what they do together. I mean, I think looking back now, that's something we would have foregrounded slightly more, because it would have made the misreading of certain passages as just masculinist, slightly wrong. I don't think it's wholly masculinist. I think what we put our finger on was what Greg called geekiness, but there is clearly something erotically charged in, you know, the ways in which numbers of black men group together as sound systems, as posses, as bands, in pursuit of rhythm. There's just something there which is not just about the exercise of male privilege, but also about the exploration of black male desires. You know, we put our finger on it, we didn't describe it well enough. I think that was the problem.
So we have got 20 minutes. I'm actually taking overtime because we started late. Are there any questions from the floor? And do we have a mic?
Are there any questions so far?
Yeah, Ralph Ellison would say, he would say, that means we beat that boy to death. As a topic. Yes. Oh.
Hello guys, my name is Deep. I'm a hip-hop artist from Egypt, and I like what you guys mentioned about Sun Ra, because Sun Ra actually did a collaboration with a jazz artist in Egypt in the 50s called Salah Ragab, and my people don't even know about that. And it's kind of sad to see that, you know, that this is part of our history, this happened. There was collaborations between artists, there was, you know, they used to tour together, and this is something that disappeared throughout time, and I don't want that to disappear, because I own the record itself, and I listen to it, and I enjoy it, and I want more people to enjoy it. I want more people to know about it, because it's very important to see how cultures are very close to each other. Especially how you look at hip-hop today, you know, it started, yes, in the States, but it had roots way before that. It had roots in, you know, in Africa, it had roots in the Arab region. We are people that love rhythm, love beats, you know. So I think it's time to bridge cultures again, especially the African continent.
Well, I think one thing that's really interesting about the generation of musicians we identify as the free jazz musicians is that for a lot of us, those were the first black internationalists, the first globalists we knew, who were maybe beginning from a Pan-Africanist kind of consciousness, but actually went out in the world and lived in communities in Africa, in Asia, in pursuit of sound, in pursuit of specific qualities of sound, in pursuit of even learning methods of instrument building. You know, so Don Cherry comes to mind in terms of that. Douglas Ewart comes to mind of that. There's a trumpeter named Graham Haynes that comes to mind, who, you know, Graham is kind of a modern example of someone who, when he becomes curious about a sound, he feels he has to move to that place and just live there and not even play for a year. So he became curious about the Cameroonian musicians in Paris. So he moved there. He became curious about certain kind of Brazilian popular songs. So when he got money to make a soundtrack for a film, he went down and bought a house, in a town near Salvador. I mean, Don Cherry is someone who lived with Tuareg musicians, Ganawa musicians. Lester Bowie of the Art Ensemble Chicago lived in Fela Shrine for another, period of months. I mean, so there's that music, the sonic foundation of it is so informed by those musicians' curiosity and desire to understand African culture, Asian cultures from the inside, and from the street level as well, And I mean, hip hop, of course, is interesting to talk about just because, like, it was kind of a meme before people would talk about memes. It kind of rode the shock wave of the digital before the digital. It kind of predicts, what people do on turntables kind of predicts everything that people will do on computers, later on samplers and so forth. So, it's always been fascinating to me just how, as soon as the rest of the world knew they were breakdancing crews in the Bronx, there were breakdancing crews like all over, the diaspora, like almost instantaneously, almost seemingly without, like before Wild Style, or before there were commercials with break. It's like somehow, it's like, and I've heard people talk about this, like they saw 2 seconds, or 20 seconds of a news report on breakdance, and then there were crews, kind of, started forming and rhyming and breaking and all that kind of stuff. So, so there's this incredible feedback loop that's kind of going on between kind of the development of rhythm culture in America, and then the way it's been kind of absorbed and refashioned and innovated, and adapted.
Yeah, thank you very much. I enjoyed your discussion. And I have a question that was also mentioned by Henriette, but I think it was not yet answered. And unfortunately, I missed the seminar with Carol about the difference between utopia, dystopia, and Afrofuturism. And I mean, when I was seeing The Last Angel of History, I had the impression that it has very much to do with this, our conference title as well, with remembering flash forward and this back to the future thing. So future and past as something that is entangled and then that maybe exists simultaneously or something like this. But I wonder how we can think about it, or how we can conceptualize it without just using it as beautiful concept or beautiful metaphor. So I wonder, what is the difference for you? What is Afrofuturism really about, if not just a black utopia or something like this?
Well, that's what it's absolutely not about, is a black utopia, for some of the reasons I've said. I mean, one of the most beautiful examples of how the term Afrofuturism might help us to understand the coexistence of the future and the present happened for me watching a film recently on a woman I'm fascinated by. I'm going to try and do something when I finish this one. It's a film made in '69 in Algeria for the Pan-African Conference. And on stage is Archie Shepp, the free jazz musician, Ted Jones, the gay beat poet, and the master musicians of Jujuka. And they are just kicking it. It's the sound is astral. And halfway through what appears to be like a 12-minute set, Ted Jones just says to the audience, "We have returned. We have returned." And he says it several times. You think, actually, this is really what we mean about Afrofuturism. For me, when you track polyrhythms, here is a figure of African descent who has short-circuited the journey, you know, and he's there as the future in the present. Ted Jones doing beat poetry to Archie Shepp playing rhythms that are clearly have some relation to, you know, African polyrhythms, but they've been explored, stretched out, I mean, just mutated beyond recognition in some places, offering that back to the present. Here's Africa's future from the past in the present. It's the attempt to think through that conundrum, which is a conundrum for all. It's not a black-related conundrum, which is why I'm saying to call it black utopia is slightly misconceived. It's not about that. It's about trying to explore this Derridian conundrum through the prism of you know, black Atlantic culture.
Well, yeah, you know, it's interesting because you make me think of a term Samuel Delany uses to describe one of his novels. He uses the term heterotopia. You know, that particular novel is about a character who it's a male character who falls so in love with a lesbian woman, performance artist, that he believes that if he transforms himself into a woman, that he'll have the possibility of having a relationship with her. But then it also occurs on a moon that is about to be devastated by an attack, you know, from a military force. So I think that when we go to any of the kind of canonical figures in this, like there's always this incredible byplay between the ecstasy of performance and the hyper-awareness of annihilation. You know, the two things are definitely held in flux. I mean, it's, in some ways, you know, I mean, the field itself, when you actually look at the work, is responding to, it's the 21st or late 20th century, 21st century variant on W. Du Bois' whole notion of a black level consciousness. You know, the awareness of a subjectivity that is invisible, you know, and denied by a world out exterior to you that is bent on your destruction. So there's all these ways in which it speaks to one's need to create as rich and fulfilling a life in the interior, you know, whether that's an interior self or community, with complete awareness of the fact that you're in a war zone, you know, a cultural, you know, kind of white supremacist kind of war zone.
I had such a flashback listening to you because I realized I am of your tribe. Since I was reading science fiction comics from Britain from the 1970s to 1992. I can time that exactly because I couldn't afford British stuff in 1992 anymore, so I stopped my subscriptions. But I also didn't feel, by that time, I went into literature, you know, of a more conventional kind, because whatever it was that I found immediately recognizable when I was from, you know, pre-teens up to my 20s, it was too expensive and it felt like a luxury in, you know, more than just financial terms. And I was trying to think, to ask this question in what doesn't seem conventional and typical, you know, so I hope it will come across like this, but in this Afrofuturist vision, where is Africa and where is Asia when it is not source material of this fantastic polyrhythmy that then gets stretched and remade and becomes the instrument of return for people who, yeah, they live for a year, but then they go back and, you know, they're the names that we know, but it is the anonymous source material who are in the background of the films and the, you know, maybe acknowledged on the CDs. And so I say that because I left that world, I guess, in 1992, and so it's out of ignorance. But is this why is this not Paul Simon? Why is this not, you know, jetting in and out?
Well, I
I'm
mean,
thinking it's not.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think the thing is that jazz musicians operate at such a degree of self-imposed poverty, you know, in terms of their work. I mean, that production rarely generates, like the work that they're already doing is like left them at the subsistence level, you know, in terms of American culture. So the fact that they're bringing in elements from other cultures is not anything that is going to increase their bounty in the popular music world. So that, I mean, that's one distinction. There is no jazz equivalent to a Paul Simon, and in terms of there's no jazz project that you would even consider equivalent to that. But then also, you know, the exchange between musicians that go on has always been mutually beneficial. You can hear that in the music itself, the way, you know, you can hear the way, I mean, musics are transformed from that exchange. Fela's music exists because of the impact that James Brown and Art Blakey and John Coltrane had on him when he went back to Nigeria, you know. And there's also, the thing is that it's not an exchange that exists between capitalized musicians and impoverished musicians in this other place. In some ways, the musicians that they encounter or have encountered are really very centered and exalted in their own communities in a way that those musicians are not at home. You know what I mean? There's certain equivalent to that, to the Detroit techno musicians, the way they're perceived in Detroit, you know, where they're truly prophets without honor. I mean, most black people I met from Detroit over the last 25 years can't stand techno music. You know what I mean? But those guys are completely a part of that Detroit community. They don't really care. You know, it's more important to Detroit that people like you as a person than they like what you're doing as music, you know. But there's always been you can go anywhere in the world and you can hear the impact and the desire to replicate the impact of Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington on the local modern musicians of that place. So, you know, it's never really been about that kind of, the conversation or the communication. It's never really been about kind of hustling and then flowing back. I mean, it's always been about kind of enlarging the vocabulary and the language that all musicians speak, you know. I mean, that's, to me, in some ways, the most utopic aspect of the jazz aesthetic, you know, the way it's always developed. It's developed in a way to, you know, in its most progressive facets, to be more inclusive of everyone's music, you know, even though it's kind of the most excluded from the cultural hierarchies, you know, in all the cities where it outside of the States, where it's really flourished.
But here's, you know, a lot of the stuff we were talking about last Angel in '94 are now just fact, you know, and it's not just about an unequal exchange anymore. The relationship is much more dynamic and fluid than that. So when Ted Jones stands in Algiers in 1969 on the African continent and says, "Your children have returned," that was a fanciful, slightly rhetorical gesture, but it did signal, in some ways, the shape of things to come. Because, of course, the return of the diaspora in its sonic variant has transformed Africa now beyond recognition. None of the musical forms currently on the continent have not been touched by this future thought. You know, this future thought that through the robotic, through the cybernetic, one can create music which further mutates African rhythms without necessarily losing it. I mean, Quayla, whatever, you name it. There's no music left on the continent now that's not touched by this. And It's now beginning to happen the other way. So that you listen to Timberland, even Timberlake, you could see, the reimportation back into, the diasporic votes, sonic insights from that part of the world. So that the dialogue is much more fluid than it was in '94, and will continue. That mutation will continue and accelerate. I think it's not going to. You know what I mean? Like you look at on YouTube, and there's a kid in Ghana who's 2 days ago saw Kanye West music video, and he's not reproduced, but he's unpicked it, he's picked up elements out of it, he's inserted it into an ongoing transformation of vernacular culture where he is. So it's not simple mimicry, it's not simple emulating of something, it's organically forcing something which is apparently from the outside, although it's yours, back into the matrix so that it can infect the matrix and produce new viral forms. That is going to continue.
Yeah, I mean, and for better or worse, Black Atlantic, Black American, Black UK based popular culture or semi-popular cultural forms are kind of emissaries of erased modernity that people outside of those zones have chosen to be highly selective of what parts they want to adapt and what parts they want to reject. So there's, in some ways, there's a very corporatized kind of, cultural imperialist kind of subjection of cultures outside of the U.S. to those figures and artists who are most dominant, on the charts here. But when you actually, travel, as friends of mine have, to Egypt or Palestine or Algeria, you find that the artists that they find that they're the most simpatico with are really the figures who are the most radical and the most marginal here, So, it's not as if that selection is without agency on the other side as well. Don Cherry could have gone to hang out with the Tuaregs, and niggas said, keep playing your horn, a friend of mine told me, he said he went with Archie Shepp the first time those musicians played with the Tuaregs, and he told me this funny story. He said all those musicians would try to jam with him. They would actually try to play over what they were playing, and the Tuareg musicians would just stop playing. And he watched this happen to several of his comrades, and he said when he got in the circle, with his little keyboard, he just started emulating what they were playing, and the conversation began. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we could continue, of course, this discussion for another couple of hours, and we will, because the screening now, but we need to move the chairs, etc. So I think we have to stop this session at this point, but we will continue. Also with Tara later at the exhibition opening talk, we continue to talk.
I do want to say something. People who are actually going to be around later this evening, when I do my DJ set, I'm completely open to the idea of those of you who are poets and MCs and so forth, kind of coming up to spit and rhyme and freestyle. Yeah, so, just pick a spot and do your thing. All right, thank you.
Thank you.